Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry Highland. I'm the community liaison with the Visiting Nurse and Hospice of Vermont and New Hampshire. Today on Let's Talk, I'm privileged to be joined by Dr. Erin Barnett, who is an assistant professor with the Department of Psychiatry, Health Policy, Clinical Practice, Health Policy and Clinical Practice, at the Giesel School of Medicine at Dartmouth. Erin also works with the Lebanon-based West Central Behavioral Health, another one of our great community partners in the Upper Valley. So today on Let's Talk, we'll be discussing caring for kids with anxiety. Sometimes, something which I think has been on the forefront of everybody's mind, most recently in the last decade, with the rise of social media, and now to boot, a global pandemic. So, Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
We're really happy to have you. So, Erin, I think what I want to start with is, could you give us some quick background on yourself, and then we'll go into the questions. And the first question is, what's normal in terms of anxiety right now for kids and likewise for adults?
Sure. So background on myself, I've lived in the Upper Valley for about 12 years. As you mentioned, I do a lot of research and training and implementation for Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and the Giesel School of Medicine, but I do still carry a small clinical practice at West Central, which is our local community mental health center where I see children and families. And I specialize in, children's mental health, traumatic stress, and anxiety. And I do a lot with really little ones. So a lot of my anecdotes today might be particularly relevant to the younger kids. So what's normal? We've been asked that a lot as mental health professionals. What should we be expecting right now during a global pandemic, particularly last spring? It was incredibly normal to be anxious. So our body has a natural stress response system that is supposed to engage under circumstances like this. So when we feel threatened, when there's, health problems, scares, fears that are very real, and that also were incredibly unpredictable. So that's the other piece about the pandemic that was so hard. Not only was it scary, but we didn't know what the extent was going to be, how it was going to spread, how it was going to be treated. We had no idea on the timeline. A lot of us thought it'd be over by Mother's Day last year, then by August. And so just the unpredictability is a big source of anxiety, no matter what, in any situation. So it was incredibly normal for all of us to be at an extra level of anxiety than what we might typically be. And we saw that. I think everyone felt that in their own lives, kids, teens, adults. Maybe some kids were shielded from it, we could hope. But even adults with really low levels of anxiety were feeling it. So very normal in the pandemic. Hopefully, people are feeling that anxiety lessened now over time, because our bodies would not be able to sustain that amount of stress because it wears and tears on our body. The stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, too much of it is not good for our physical health and our mental health. So I think most people have hopefully found ways to deal with it, and the pandemic is hopefully slowing and getting better. And so if you're still finding yourself at a super high level of anxiety, you might be wanting some help for yourself, or if that's true for your children or your teens, now that the world, or at least in the United States, is starting to open up and in our communities, people might find that if the anxiety doesn't come back down, there might be some troubles and you might want some extra help.
Yeah, thank you for that, Erin. And I think you touched on a great point. Is even though the world may normalize, our approach to the world might not so quickly. And I've noticed that myself, going back out and shopping and seeing more and more folks. It's strange, it's like, wow, things are changing back to normal. But this new normal that we've gotten used to over the past year and a half has really changed people's perceptions. So when it comes to kids with anxiety, how does that present? Does it present differently for different age groups of kids?
Yeah, it sure does. So I'm going to talk about the course of anxiety over childhood or over your life, and then I'll tell you about specific types of anxiety that can show up in childhood. Typically before age 5, 6, 7, we think of children as sort of shy or less shy. We don't necessarily call it anxiety a lot. Once in a while, we'll see some real anxious little kids, but we think of it a little bit differently. And what's interesting and cool, I think, is our temperament before age 5, 6, 7, whether we're shy or not, doesn't necessarily predict how we are later in life. So shy kids don't all become anxious, and outgoing little kids don't all become sort of extroverts with low anxiety, which is just interesting how the brain continues to develop and rewire based on, again, the genetic programming, but also the environment in which the child is in, mixed in with sort of just the temperament and the biology. It is definitely an art. Anybody who says, all this stuff is an exact science is lying. It's very hard to know how the course of anxiety might develop. But that's important that, we'll see sort of temperaments early on, and it might change. Usually by 6, 7, 8, we talk about kids who are shy might come out of their shells, and that might be true. And then during middle childhood, which is that elementary school age, we will see onsets of what looks like anxiety. What is anxiety? And the onset is earlier than depression. So anxiety and depression are big childhood disorders. And we usually don't see depression until teenage years, once in a while. But the average age of anxiety onset is actually 9 or 10. It's less noticeable sometimes because they keep to themselves, and you can sort of play it off as they're still shy, and maybe they are, and that's okay. But once it gets to a certain level where it's interfering with their functioning, you might want a little help for the child. Whereas depression, we'll notice, I think, a little bit more, especially if it's an irritable depression, because they start acting out and they start getting real grumpy. So it's easier for people to notice maybe some depression. And then, into teenage years, we'll see sort of another spike of late teens of onset of anxiety. And that's generally when a lot of our mental health problems start or onset. And that's true for across the board. Most mental health problems start late teens, early 20s. And we believe that's because it's a real rapid brain development period again, and a real rapid time of social and emotional development, because we're getting intimate with friends and partners and a new life and new goals and careers and such. And so we're a bit vulnerable at that time. So anytime throughout there, if there is a traumatic event, big T trauma, meaning abuse, neglect, fire, tornado, horrible medical accident. I'm leaving some out, but you get the idea. We will see some anxiety responses in a lot of kids after a big T trauma and after small T traumas like a pandemic and divorce and some other things that are stressful that usually we can overcome those things. And it's important that kids do have stress. And so I'm not trying to say that we need to keep kids from stress. They do need stress. And these small T traumas are a normal part of many people's lives. But we'll see an uptick in anxiety during those stressful small T traumas as well. And we'll see a lot of anxiety following early neglect. So if a child was in a neglectful situation early on, wasn't getting the buffering from stress, the caregiving, the attunement that humans need in order to develop socially and emotionally in a healthy way, that will often manifest as anxiety as the kid gets older and older and older, which is linked in with sort of attachment theory, that they'll show a lot of generally anxious symptoms. So to kind of piggyback on the developmental stages of anxiety, it is going to look different. So, under age 5 or 6, we have a joke saying they'll show us through eat, sleep, and poop. kids can't tell us, well, little kids can't tell us how they're feeling very well. Especially really little kids before they can even act out, right? You can't really act out till you're, 18 months or 2. So then we'll start noticing. The problem is 2-year-olds act out anyway, even when there's nothing wrong and there's little anxiety. So it's really hard. But we'll see disruptions to their eating schedules, might become really picky or overeat, disruptions to sleeping. And also that changes just with normal kids too. Sleep off, the sleep cycle changes, but a lot more difficulty with sleep. And then, digestion and the GI tract, and both a physical response to, going number 1 and number 2, and also if anxiety, if one of the responses to the anxiety is to try to gain control over the situation, those are the only things little kids have control over. They don't get to decide where they go in the day. They don't get to decide what they wear. They don't get to decide what they eat, what's put in front of them at least. But they do pretty much get to decide like what's actually put in their mouth, and when they go to the bathroom and where, and when they fall asleep. So they will exert control in those areas as a way of sort of trying to manage their anxiety. Middle childhood, so that elementary school age, kids go in and they don't share a lot sometimes. And so they'll be withdrawn and isolated often. Sometimes they'll start acting out when they're pushed to do things that are going to make them anxious. They'll act out, yell and seem non-compliant and seem oppositional and difficult. So we'll see a lot of that. And then teen years, again, there's a lot of withdrawal. There's a lot of avoidance of situations that make them anxious that they don't want to confront. We'll start thinking more about trying to help them find their anxious thoughts and their triggers. And then, sometimes in teenage years, they're at pretty high risk of substance use. Once they can get their hands on cannabis or pot or alcohol, we can't lie. Like, it is in the very short term pretty good at reducing anxiety. It has a lot of problems and it's not good in the long term. But so we'll see some of that used to try to bring down the anxiety.
That was great. What a in-depth answer. And I really appreciate the description of the physical manifestations of it. I think, a lot of people feel these things and it's physically affecting their body and they don't know what to tie it to. So it's nice to know that maybe it could be anxiety. And I also like to say, I think you described everything in a way that I guess makes it okay to feel like maybe you're part of that stereotyped group. I think when I think of a film or a TV show describing angsty children, for lack of a better term, and you say that's a stereotype. Well, I mean, all stereotypes can be born from some sort of truth. And now we can understand why that feeling might be occurring or why that teen might be withdrawing. So don't discount it as they're just that age. Try and figure out the root cause. And in this case, it could be anxiety. It's great. Really descriptive. I appreciate it. So I think we'll move on forward to some ways we can deal with anxiety a little bit. So what are some hardcore principles that a parent could live by when they're caring for anxious kids?
Yeah, and these also depend on the age, right? With the little ones, it's a ton of reassurance and nurturance and caring. We don't have to push them out of the nest when they're super little. It's still fairly normal for them to be needy and clingy. Sometimes in our Western independent culture, we're given messages to separate, you don't need me, go do your thing. But I'm really rooted in attachment theory also. So there's also something to be said about just waiting it out for those little ones and see if they're going to grow out of it. You can't completely keep them from all anxious situations, but there's more of a rationale to do that when they're little and keep them relatively protected. But at some point, of course, they need to be in the world. So even as they get older, we do like that reassurance that things are okay, that things are safe, that they can do this, they can do hard things. That's one of my favorite lines. You can do hard things, even if you're anxious. So helping them identify the feeling and name it. It sounds so easy, too easy, but it's really important because identifying a feeling gives kids a sense of power over it and it externalizes it. Like, I am not anxiety, I have anxiety. So when this feeling of anxiety comes, this is what it is, this is what I can do. So naming when you're feeling, when the kids are worried or nervous or anxious, giving them those words, reassuring them, you know, when things are safe, when that they can do things, that they're strong, that they can do hard things, and that you're there to help them. So that's that other piece about, you know, attachment is you're there. They can come to you. You need to be the helper, the healer, the container. It's not all on them, because especially little kids and even teens still aren't ready to do that, which leads into the next R, which is regulate. And little kids need caregivers to co-regulate them, right? So it's hugging, it's holding, it's physical, it's talking, it's singing, those kind of things when they're real little. Eventually, then the hope is that the child internalizes that skill. They know what it feels like to soothe themselves because they've been soothed. So you can't skip that. You can't skip that step of soothing them, right? They have to know how that feels, and then eventually they start doing it on their own, and it takes some longer than others. But regulating them as they get older, they can start using their own skills on their own, which is great. A lot of breathing techniques, a lot of sort of calming, relaxation is some people hate it and some people love it, but it works if you're the one that loves it. So those sort of staple skills that we like to use when people like them. And then as people get older, we can teach them to regulate their thoughts. So we have to notice our anxious thoughts first, like someone's going to get me, there's a monster in the closet, nobody likes me on Facebook. Oh, kids don't use Facebook. Nobody likes me on Insta, you know? So like you have to realize what the anxious thoughts are and help them catch those. And again, just identifying those is a helpful skill because it externalizes it. And then you can also gently challenge those anxious thoughts. Like just the other day with a kid, she was worried someone was going to break in and kidnap her. And we were able to challenge that thought. Like, what are the chances in your town that someone's going to break in the middle of the night and actually get you and take you, right? And we actually looked up the stats, and it's like 0.00007% chance that there's going to be a kidnapping in this town. So you can challenge some of those thoughts. So that's part of regulating. And then routine is critical, especially for the younger kids. Predictable routine they love. And let's face it, we can't always have a perfect routine. So you're going to have to break the routine, and that's part of life, and that's okay. If you can help them predict it and prepare for it ahead of time, you're going to be way more successful. So if you know there's going to be a substitute teacher, if they're not going to dad's that weekend, you're switching up weekends. If it's going to be a different coach, if whatever, their favorite stuffy's in the dryer, you know, preparing them for it. So if there's a change in routine, giving them the heads up so they can start getting used to the idea.
Wow, that was really great. You know, so let me make sure I got those 3 R's. We have reassure, regulate, and routine. Love it.
Yep.
Those are great things to live by. I mean, and I was thinking as you were describing them, how they work together, you know, because on that routine change, you're going to have to go in and then reassure the child that it's okay. That's awesome. And it's great advice. Thank you for that, Erin. And I also noticed, and I mentioned at the beginning, the rise of social media. You mentioned Insta. You know, I think these things can be damaging, or at least, you know, overwhelming for kids. I think would be my thought. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I didn't even know you were going to ask me about this, but you hit a really important hot spot for me. And the jury's in. Social media is bad for us. It's bad for our mental health. I think we were all kind of hoping over the last decade, oh, there's some good parts about it. Oh, and there
It's a
are. Of
tool.
course there are.
It's
Yeah, of
fun
course there
here.
are. Like you can see grandma's pictures. It's so cool. Um, but the data just keeps rolling in. It's bad for our mental health all around. Um, and I don't think it's going away. So,
Yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm sure we could spend a long
yeah,
time. But I think it's kind of
yeah,
ironic that here we are using social media as a tool for this
yeah,
education, Facebook. And I think it's really a fine line. And, that's the world we're living in 2021, where teens and younger kids even now being on these things so early, can't draw that line. When should I turn it off, right?
right, right. Yeah, I think it's just gonna have to be just like everything else that came with the internet, right? Adult explicit material, um, predators, right? All these other things that came with internet now that our kids are online so much younger. Social media is right in there. We just have to talk. We just have to talk to them about it. How do you feel when you post something and nobody likes it, or they like your friends, or you don't have the followers? Like letting people know what social media values, making money, right? Selling the ads, what it's trying to do, which is to get you to stay on the site longer so you see their ads, and how that can impact your social life. I feel like being left out is a part of life, and feeling like you're not good enough is a part of life, and that's okay. We have to figure that out. But whatever dose we used to get of those feelings from just running into people or hearing about people that were doing things without us, or seeing once in a while people who were so much better at things than we were, right? That was manageable as a human socially. And now just to be bombarded with those messages, I think is just too much, too fast, too much stimulation to manage. And I think you're right, manifests in some anxiety for teens. So talking about how they're what they post, how it makes other people feel, what their purpose is to make them look cool, to make them seem popular. Like what is your purpose when you post this? What is your purpose when you like? What is your purpose when you want to get likes? Is that what you want out of life? Like these sort of big questions. That's going to be really hard if kids are on social media pretty young. I think teenagers can start to get all of that. This is going to be interesting to navigate. Yeah.
And I think this discussion leads us perfectly into the next question, because I'm going to ask if you can provide some real tips that caregivers can do with their kids when they have anxiety, and maybe also at the end of that question, relate it back to the social media discussion.
Yeah, you can remind me if I forget that last part.
Sure.
So I talked a lot about predictability. A couple of tools that I love, particularly for those under 6, 7, 8, if they have to transition, that's so hard for kids who are anxious, transitioning to school or to grandmas or to moms for overnight or whatever it is. Transition objects. So take your favorite blanket, take your favorite stuffy. If they can take a pet, if they can take something that reminds them of their secure attachment figure, that's really helpful, even if it's for camp. Um, and then help them visualize this. I found this really successful. So let's pretend someone's going to grandma's for the weekend, right? Mom and dad need a break. They have to work, whatever it is. That's life. Like we need our village. So, but the kid's nervous. So, okay, so we're going to get there and Grammy's going to give you a big hug. And then you're going to go play on the playground. That's a couple of blocks away. So they're starting to picture what it's going to look like. And then you'll probably watch a movie. What movie do you want to watch? So they're getting an idea of what's going to happen. And then do you remember what Grammy's bedroom, the one you stay in, looks like? Remember, it's got blue walls and she'll tuck you in. So you're just talking her through it. And then help them visualize sometimes what you're going to be doing when they're gone. I'm going to be doing dishes. I'm going to be going to work, and then when we see each other, we'll give each other a big hug again and we'll, whatever, fold the laundry from the weekend so they can Again, that predictability I find really helpful to walk through. So that's one. Again, I already touched on some of these, but as kids get older, you can help them identify their worries and their anxious thoughts. I didn't really talk about this much, but we have what's called general anxiety, where you just sort of worry about everything. We have social anxiety, which, you know, when you're supposed to talk in front of others, perform, sports, you know, anytime the teacher calls on you, and at the core is that you're going to be judged on your performance. And under that is they'll think I'm stupid. The words won't come out right. I'll sound dumb. They won't like what I say. I won't do well at soccer. So these thoughts of like, I'm going to be judged and I'm going to do poorly are underneath of that one. So eventually you can help find those worries and talk through them and see how helpful they are or how true they are. And most of them are not true. Like for social anxiety, not everybody's staring at you in the middle of the soccer field. Like they're all looking at their own kid. They're not looking at you, right? Or, you know, if you have to be called on in class, you know, not everybody's sitting there thinking you're a dummy, right? They're just worried about when they're going to get called on, and they're worried about their homework that's late. And so getting them to have a more realistic idea that those thoughts may not be true or may not be helpful. And then again, some of the breathing is really useful, or any kind of like mindfulness or meditation processes can be helpful. And then a quick note, if there is, we haven't talked a lot about like traumatic stress, but if there is a stressor, a trauma, like a big T trauma, going on that's making kids anxious, then of course we try our best to get rid of that, right? So if there's violence in the home, if there's abuse, if there's, you know, whatever it might be, we try to get rid of that trauma and stop it, and then help them feel safe. Sometimes even when they are safe, they still don't feel safe. So talking about it and helping them actually feel that sense of safety. Until that occurs, you're not going to reduce anxiety. It's got to stay. It's playing its role, what it's supposed to be doing in those situations.
Great, that's really helpful. I appreciate it. I think we haven't had any questions come in, so I was trying to save some time for the end at that. Maybe there's some anxiety about posting questions, but that's okay. So why don't we use that time instead to talk about social media again?
Yeah, I think probably, again, lots of discussions of what's the purpose of social media. What are the, you know, developers trying to do? What are the ads trying to get you to do? What they're trying to keep you on? And then what is everyone's goal when they're posting, right, and when they're liking, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, setting limits becomes such a battle for every family. I mean, the technology and the social media limits are just a huge, huge battle. And you have to decide within your family whether you want to fight that battle. And I think you should. Some rules of thumb that I really like are, until a certain age, no screens, no phones in the bedroom. At a certain, you know, I think probably at a certain age as a teenager, you know, that can change, but no tablets.
In general,
no
I think what we're touching on is the parent has a responsibility to set some limits, you know, at its root core. And whether that is, like you described, no screens in the bedroom or a certain age, you know, I think empowering parents to make that call and not maybe falling into their own peer pressure or anxiety that their kid needs a phone to fit in or whatever,
yeah,
I think is maybe a good place to start.
Yeah, that's a great point. Reflecting on your own sort of baggage or your own experiences when you were younger, if any of that's shown up for you, and sort of the popularity, needs, and drives. We're all vulnerable to it. We can't help it. We're social creatures. We're vulnerable to it. And helping the kids understand that process too, to be liked, to be wanted, to be popular. and some kind of limits around, nighttime, no phones in the room at bedtime, probably some limits around dinner time and evening time, right?
Set
But I
family
think more
time.
than that, it's talking it through.
Right.
What is your brain not doing, and what's your body not doing when you're, staring at your phone the whole time? There's nothing like that evil about watching screens. It's what you're not doing. You're not getting like actual interaction with actual humans. You're not out in nature. You're not, using creativity mostly. Sometimes you are, but what are you not getting? What are you not developing if all of your attention is on texting and the social media platforms? Is that
Thank
helpful?
you. No, that's perfect. And you know what? In that discussion, we did have 2 questions come in, so let's answer those before we end. So we have one here that says, what tips would you have for coaches and non-parent trusted adults who work with kids in sports to initiate a discussion with a kid who is having anxiety issues?
Great point. I just was reading something about how we could overhaul our entire mental health using people like coaches. So that's a great question. I think a lot of these principles can apply. And I think just the idea of a coach talking about mental health is so cool, right? You don't have to use the word mental health, whatever, but you're paying attention to feelings, to frustrations, to anxieties, to sadness. You're naming them. I mean, starting by naming them, it's so simple and it seems too simple. But it's the first step almost every time. Oh, yeah, you're nervous about that. Oh, I used to be nervous about that too. And kind of using that language, and you can build a culture in your team, just like teachers build a culture in their classrooms more and more around social emotional life and curriculum and growth. You can start doing that in your team, and it just is using the language. And then it's, you can elicit worries. Is there something in particular you're worried about? For most anxious kids in a sports situation, my guess is it's that social performance anxiety. So you could beat them to that worry. Like, nobody's just watching you, like, we're not judging you. You're not getting rated. Well, I don't know. Once you get to high school, you are, but at a younger age, you're not getting rated. You're not getting judged. We're not here to say how good you are. And not everybody's watching you. Sort of some of those thoughts.
Yeah, and if I could add one more piece to that. So at the beginning, you definitely touched on those 3 R's again. You're reassuring. That's the initial discussion. But to reassure, you suggested that the coach relates. I remember what it was like to me. So then we've added, this fourth sub R. I love that.
There you
So
go.
reassure and relate, that opens the door. So I hope that answers that question for folks.
You could also
Um,
use the routine, or tell them
and
what's going to
continue.
happen. Tell them how the practice is going to go. First, we're going to run 2 laps. Then we're going to do long jump. Then we're going to do whatever.
Exactly. That's awesome. So the second question we had here, my son has extreme anxiety with remote learning. Great point. He refuses to speak or turn on his camera. It's affecting his grades significantly. How could I encourage him to participate? Could you also suggest maybe a way that the school could help?
Yeah, I don't blame him. A lot of people don't want those cameras on. I'm not sure how old he is. I mean, my instinct is just to get him back in real life, real in-person learning. That's the easiest solution, is work hard. Hopefully in the fall that comes back. We have seen a lot of literature, including one national study around children and their parents who were engaged in hybrid or full-time remote learning, produced significantly worse mental health outcomes in the past year than the children and the parents of the children who were full-time in person. So
And
number
a
one, get them in
qualifier,
person.
Erin, he's in 7th grade, we just found out.
Okay, 7th grade. I mean, I would ask the teacher if they can accommodate to keep the camera off, honestly. But the other thing I would do is elicit some of those worries. What are you worried about if the camera's on? They're looking at me, they'll see my zits, they'll think I'm ugly, it's those judgmental fears of being on camera that I think is probably a social anxiety kind of at the core, would be my guess. And then you would combat that with, well, there's 9 other kids on the camera. They're not just staring at you. You can sit way back if you want. They can't see every zit, whatever the example is. You would try to switch around those anxious thoughts. And if there's an extra educator or a paraprofessional, could they just call on the phone, right? Could they just accommodate by using non-video? I just want remote learning to go away. This is my personal and professional opinion. It needs to go away. For most kids, there might be a small narrow slice for whom it works, and it works okay.
Great, thank you for that. And yeah, you definitely touched on it. We're social animals, and I think even though remote tries so hard and the tools are existing and they get better every day to make it feel like we're in the room with folks, it's not the same. And I think that's something that we're learning over the past years, that people are not experiencing that same connection that they ever experienced in person, and that's a huge part of learning. So good luck with that to the questioner, and I hope we helped a little bit. So Erin, I think we're going to wrap up. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. I think this was helpful for a ton of people. We do have one more quick question. She says, other than sessions like this, what other resources or places might we be able to find education on this? So that's a great question. Maybe direct us to a website or two.
Yeah. Good question. I'm wondering if...
Or West Central, can they call? Is there a helpline there? I don't remember.
Yeah, well, we have an emergency services line, which sounds like probably is not the case. You can engage in services for sure. Call the intake line, 542-5128, I believe. You might want to Google it first. Well, that's West Central on the New Hampshire side. It's HCRS and Clare Mountain on the Vermont side, and others. So I wonder if SAMHSA has anything on children's anxiety. SAMHSA. The CDC might have something on children's anxiety specifically. If it stems from a trauma, the best resource is nctsn.org, nctsn.org. And if it's a young children under age 3, the best resource is probably all spelled out, 0to3.org, 0to3, all spelled out. And that really integrates attachment theory with anxiety and depression and other mental health issues, because it's, attachment is so core early on. So hopefully those help.
Great. I'm going to pop those into the comment right now. I think I got them right, but people can do Googling in case some of my acronyms are a little off. Great. I think that's it, Erin. I really appreciate it. We answered all the questions. And again, this was wonderful. I'm sure everybody learned a lot. I know I did. And thank you for making the time for us.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.